Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Gary Parker. I am the Associate Dean for External Affairs at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, where I also serve as the inaugural director of the Clark Fox Policy Institute. But today I am joining you as a member of Influencing Social Policy, also known as ISP. ISP is an organization for educators and students and practitioners with a passion for social work and policy. And the goal is to prepare and motivate social workers and other practitioners to play an active role in shaping the social policies that impact the communities we serve. And this is our Power of Macro Social Work series featuring the macro partners of ISP. But before we get into today's program, I just wanted to first share with you that although your cameras and microphones have been disabled, we absolutely want to hear from you. So please use the chat feature to send us messages and to engage our panelists in conversations. And I also want to let you know that our next program is on Monday, April 4th at this same time. I hope you'll join us for Deconstructing Inclusion, big difference, Beyond a Seat at the Table. That is going to be sponsored by ISP, the Grand Challenges for Social Work, and the Network for Social Work Management. I want to thank Pilar Horner, ISP's president, the members of the board, and our incredible macro partners. And I also want to thank the Brown School for allowing us to use their open classroom platform to host us. Today, ISP is partnering with ACOSA, the Association for Community Organization and Social Action. And the topic is social workers as bridge builders, a really important and interesting topic. So I'm going to hand it over to Jason Ostrander, who is assistant professor at Sacred Heart. His research and practice focuses on the political participation of social workers, social and economic justice, program evaluation, and policy implications relating to vulnerable populations. Jason, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Gary. Welcome to everybody. I have the honor, I guess you could say, of serving as the MC for today. We're really hoping to have a more of a dialogue after some initial comments from the panelists. So to start this conversation, I'm going to just introduce each of the panelists in alphabetical order, just so you can learn something about each of them. Karen. So Dr. Karen DeAngelo is assistant professor at Southern Connecticut State University Department of Social Work, where she leads their new concentration, community practice, community organizing, policy, and leadership. Her scholarship focuses on health inequities and particularly community-based participatory research methodologies. She just concluded serving a 3-year term as a board member of ACOSA. Dr. Jan Ivery is Assistant Dean of Academic Programs at the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies and is Associate Professor of Social Work at Georgia State University. Her research focuses on collaborative community partnerships and service delivery and capacity building. She has taught undergraduate and graduate courses in case management, leadership, and management research methods and field. Dr. Ivery has been a ACOSA regional representative, co-chair of the organization, and she helped develop the implementation of ACOSA's National Community Practice Certificate Program. Dr. Amy Krings is an associate professor of social work at Loyola University in Chicago. Her research focuses on how marginal groups strategically and collectively advance social and environmental justice, and how social workers and community organizations can support individuals in becoming social change agents. Her practice experience includes work on local elections as a community organizer, grant writer, and director of a nonprofit focused on violence reduction and police reform. She's a member of the Grand Challenge Advisory Council on Social Responses to a Changing Environment, a board member of ACOSA, and a board member of ISP. Last but not least is Dr. Amy Murphy-Nugen, who is Associate Professor and Grad Program Director in the Department of Social Work at West Carolina University, where her scholarship agenda is supported by over 20 years of practice and policy experience in the areas of housing and economic development. Her research interests include public policy analysis, affordable housing, community economic development, and nonprofit management leadership. Her immediate scholarship intersects social determinants of health factors as they relate to social justice, equity, individual well-being, and community quality of life. So welcome to the panelists. Just for those that are watching, the agenda is I'm going to let Dr. AMN, just so we have the right Amy, talk to you guys and set the context for the next 10 minutes. She may use a little less. Then we're gonna go into having each of the panelists talk for about 5 minutes on their work. And then the last part will be an open dialogue discussion on this very important topic that we're discussing today. So I'm gonna turn the floor over to Dr. AMN.
Thank you, Jason. And could I get a thumbs up if you all can see my PowerPoint? Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I know today's discussion's topic is of interest to many social workers as we try to navigate bridge building during pandemics, increasing incivility, and growing misinformation. Of course, community building and policy practice has always been a career-long interest to me, as I suspect is true for most of you joining us today. And the opportunities and challenges associated with these two areas of macro practice have become even more critical over the last couple of years. In February 2020, I was selected by the small rural mountain town that I live in to chair and facilitate a task force on homelessness. As I'm sure is the case with many of your respective communities, a position like this one presents many opportunities and also significant challenges. Did I mention it was February 2020 when this announcement was made? So our first meeting was scheduled to take place in March 2020, and I think we all know how the story goes from there. We decided to delay our first meeting given the uncertainty that COVID-19 presented, as well as considering that many of our task force members were service providers and emergency responders, and they needed to focus on immediate public health concerns that none of us completely understood at that moment. Even though I have been engaged in community development and planning for over 2 decades, working in communities primarily in the Midwest, but also from Oregon to New Jersey, I had never experienced anything like I have over the last couple of years. From in between about June 2020 to October 2021, I experienced my own crash course in the challenges of community building and planning during a pandemic, growing incivility, as well as misinformation and disinformation campaigns. Given my recent experience, and as we begin today, I would like to help set the context for our discussion. I think the challenges of community building and policy practice in the middle of a pandemic are fairly understandable. Following the public health guidance that was given to us, many folks immediately engaged in socially and physically distancing from one another. Some of our most engaged citizens virtually became invisible for over a year, stretching into 2 years. Folks that we were used to seeing at public hearings or town halls were suddenly isolated, attempting to stay healthy and maintaining new home and education expectations. We also saw the pandemic impact the respective populations that we serve in various ways. For example, people who were unhoused, the focus of my community building and planning work, were at particular risk of experiencing the harshness of COVID-19. The isolation associated with the pandemic not only removed people from public and civic life, but it also resulted in negative mental health consequences. Certainly not caused by the pandemic, but impacted by it, we've seen an increase in incivility over the last several years, which has only intensified over the last couple. In many ways, it seems that we've lost our ability to speak with one another, particularly among those of us who hold different perspectives and values. 8 in 10 Americans feel political discourse has become less respectful and more negative over the last several years. Further, 75% think violence is more likely toward groups that are the target of, quote, heated and aggressive, end quote, rhetoric by elected officials. These perspectives are not outside of our current reality. Following a 3-year reported rise in 2017, hate crimes have increased by 17%. Further, recognized hate groups in the United States are also increasing. From roughly 2014 to 2018, there was a 30% increase in the number of documented hate groups, representing a 20-year high. Demonstrations and rallies promoting hate-filled ideology have increased, along with violent acts. In 2018, 50 people were murdered by US-based domestic extremists, representing the 4th deadliest year for killings linked to domestic extremism since 1970. Our campuses have not been spared from the growing ideological extremism associated of violence. Several bigoted and racially motivated acts have occurred on numerous university campuses over the last several years. One of the most notorious and hate-filled crimes occurred at the, quote, Unite the Right, end quote, gathering of noted white supremacists on the University of Virginia campus in Charlottesville, which tragically culminated in the death of a counter-protester, Heather Heyer, and injured at least 19 other individuals. Grievously, there are more campus incidents than I have time to reflect upon here. Yet what we witnessed at UVA and Charlottesville represents the inevitable outcomes that lie at the intersection of the increasing incivility and hate we are experiencing in our society. In addition to the tragic loss of life, extremism and resulting tragedies also have a chilling effect on civil discourse and engagement. Although many factors beyond this increasing extremism likely influence people's perception of political and civic engagement, it is relevant to consider that most people now find it, quote, stressful and frustrating, end quote, to have political dialogue with individuals of differing perspectives. The number of people who report experiencing this frustration has grown from 46% to 53% in recent years. Further, approximately 66% of each of the youngest generations, that includes Generation Zers, Millennials, and Xers, have a negative perception of the direction in which the US is headed. These bleak statistics represent the dire circumstances that our clients face and which we must confront in our community, policy practice, teaching, and research. The January 6th insurrection was a critical and violent breakdown in public life. The attack on the Capitol building by supporters of former President Trump for the purpose of overturning the 2020 presidential election resulted in disrupting the congressional session to count electoral votes. Policymakers and staff members were evacuated from the seat of our government as law enforcement officers were assaulted. 5 people died in association with the attack. Many individuals were injured, including at least 138 law enforcement officers. 4 law enforcement officers who defended the Capitol died by suicide within 7 months of January the 6th. The January 6th insurrection was rooted in both misinformation and disinformation, as we also have experienced at our local and state levels. To clarify, misinformation is false or inaccurate information without the intention to mislead. Disinformation is false information that is explicitly intended to deceive or mislead. It's often a tool of propaganda campaigns used to undermine civic and civil life. It undermines trust in institutions and valid information. Growing distrust in institutions and in the government in particular make bridge building even more challenging. Further, it is not just institutions that are subject to growing scrutiny and suspicion. Increased mistrust between and among citizens continue to fester as political and ideological divides are emphasized. A recent study indicated that slightly less than a majority, about 47% of people, think most people cannot be trusted. The not-for-profit sector is not immune to increasing levels of distrust. Only 19% of individuals say they highly trust charitable organizations. Yet comparatively, the sector remains one of the most trusted institutions in US society, with social service organizations enjoying some of the highest levels of integrity within the public. As we consider where social workers may have the opportunity to build bridges in our community building and policy practice, we must also acknowledge the need for ethical boundaries and authentic social work practice. Bernice King, daughter of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., has said, quote, "It is divisive to call for unity without working for justice. It is uncivilized to ask for civility while prospering from and perpetuating systemic violence. True peace," my father said, "is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice." Bernice King continues, "Kindness matters, but kindness does not equal justice. Unity matters, but unity is often about maintaining an unjust status quo. Civility matters, but pleas for civility without justice yield false peace. We need true peace, which includes justice. Let's unite for that." End quote. As we engage in our discussion today and long-term bridge building work into the future, let us commit to actively challenging and working to dismantle oppressive and violent systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. AMN. I would like to give Karen 5 minutes to speak with us, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me and for joining us today. I guess when I was thinking about how to respond to this discourse, I was thinking about, as most academics do, my scholarship, research, and my teaching and my service. And so I guess I'll frame my response in those contexts. In terms of research, my focus is on community-based participatory research. And I think in light of these evolving times, this has dramatically impacted how I look at that research. Not just in terms of methodology, which obviously has had some significant limitations living in a pandemic on doing community engaged work in general, but also the bridge building component. You know, how do we engage diverse constituencies and promote inclusivity, true inclusivity in those contexts? And so I also mentioned that during 2020, I was living in Chicago and I moved to Connecticut in the middle of the pandemic in a different community. And that has also been transformative for me. Highlighting some of what I learned from my Chicago students was the meaningful work of mutual aid. And I think as community practitioners, that is something that we need to amplify and elevate. And previous to the pandemic, we really haven't done a great job, I think, of keeping our scholarship up to date with real world practices that communities were using on the ground. And I think that, you know, this is an opportunity to kind of revisit that and revisit how are we partnering with communities and being able to elevate the work that's happening at the grassroots level, so that we're coming in not necessarily as academic experts, but we're actually building upon the real world experts, the grassroots experts of those with lived experience. And so that is something that I bring to both my teaching and my research. And so mutual aid, I think, is one component that we could better incorporate into mutual aid as a community response. I'm referring to not just as a group process, better integrate that into our research and teaching. And coming into Connecticut, I have since become a core leader of a newly developed refugee resettlement group, community-based refugee resettlement group, which is a new phenomenon in general, established under the Biden administration, but that has also been a really important learning practice for me regarding mutual aid at the community level. How are we building infrastructure and drawing in new constituencies to support Afghan humanitarian parolees that are new to our community? And so that is where I draw upon my practice experience or service experience into my teaching. And then I think lastly, I'm happy to elaborate on any of these examples more thoroughly, but lastly, I'll talk about abolitionist social work, which is also something that's been a lot more pressing on my mind, both in terms of the context of working in Connecticut and grassroots efforts to explore this area of practice, but also in terms of teaching. So really working to establish an anti-racist frame in research courses with a decolonization perspective has been really fun, I would say, actually one of the more meaningful things that we've been doing. And then really incorporating, access for students using an open access textbook, flipping the classroom so that it's learning directed and student directed as opposed to top-down learning, which most traditional research courses are, and really making it learner centric and teaching in a university that's primarily serving students of color in a BSW program. I also teach at the MSW and DSW as well, but this research course is particularly at the BSW level. In a university that claims to be a social justice university, it's been really fun and productive, and I'm happy to hopefully have more of this conversation. How do we be leaders in terms of what we speak to in terms of our values?
Thank you, Karen. Dan, it's your turn.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you all. And I have to say, my colleagues who've gone before me, I had remarks outlined, but you've totally changed what I think I wanted to talk about my experience, because as you all were talking, I'm shaking my head and turning like, yes, I remember that during those early days in spring 2020. Personally, it was interesting for me because I just transitioned into an administrative role. Like, I think I literally started February 15th and the world shut down a month before. We all of a sudden had to flip our entire school and the entire university. And I have to say that being prepared as a macro social worker in that bridge building was very valued. And I think people outside of social work were able to see it because, as I mentioned, I'm in the School of Policy Studies. So our other units include urban studies, economics, criminal justice, and public management and policy. So we have some that kind of got it. And then when a lot of the race stuff started to come out and equity, it was kind of a question of, well, who can they ask? And they kept asking me. And I'm like, I don't have all of the answers. I appreciate that you recognize my training and professional experiences as a social worker, but we don't have all the answers. But I think it highlighted the importance of how we're able to reach across the proverbial aisles, because it took a lot of understanding, because we had some economics faculty who teach large 100, 200 student classes, but they don't even think about these issues. They're worried to make sure they understand the differences between macro and microeconomics. What does all this stuff happening in their lives have to do in the classroom? So a lot of that bridge building was putting that understanding and putting that lens of what our students were experiencing kind of in their student roles, what was happening outside of our walls at Georgia State. Because at Georgia State, we are right in the middle of downtown. And not unlike other cities, the pandemic really highlighted the housing needs and inequities. Like walking into the office, the streets were just filled now with tent cities. And how did we work with students who were having these questions like, wow, this is really in our face. We've kind of been focused on our student role, walking past these inequities that we see every day. But now I realize we can do something more besides our internships and what we're learning in the class. So to me, it was an eye-opening. And then it also led to, well, what can we do to bring these people together? So I think some of the things that stood out to me was consistent presence, which I think is very important, because both of my colleagues who've gone ahead talked about the fact that we were socially isolated. We weren't connecting like we were. We weren't having meetings, which for organizers, that is like organizing one-on-one with food. Now we have these rules that you can't really eat with people because you have to wear masks, you have to sit apart. So I think a consistent presence, both here kind of in my official role in the university with consistent messaging, as accurate as we could get it, that it was timely, and we opened the opportunity for people to express their feedback, what they liked, didn't like what we were doing, where, areas that we could improve. Out of that, when we talk about our social work skills, we launched an initiative called our peer coaching model, which we had initially planned on implementing for our online programs to support our students who aren't meeting in person and are 100% online. But at the pandemic, we said, why don't we hurry up and do it when we come back from spring break? So it was a little stressful launching a whole program in 10 days. But I'm proud to say that I've been able with my colleagues to build it up to where we hire social work graduate research assistants, and they reach out to students who aren't engaging in their classes through their iCollege platform. So if they aren't logging in, they reach out to them with a message of, hey, how are you doing? What's going on? And they connect them with resources. So one of the things that's come out for me personally and professionally is seeing how our macro social workers have been able to bridge that gap between our students and their communities. I also saw this in my role at the time because I was co-chair of ACOSA. So again, consistent messaging. One of the things about the co-chair and I realized is while we were in what's going on, our members were having the same thing. Like, where are we? We had these great plans of looking at our strategic plan, restructuring our organization, and we realized people aren't there. So we had a lot of conversations of how can we still meet the needs of our members, move the organization forward, and still remain connected. So one of the things that we did that we didn't expect would take off, we instituted happy hours. No agenda, people would just come, they could just talk. Some people brought adult beverages if they wanted to. And it was just a good way for us to connect and stay connected with our members. And in conclusion, I think one of the things that I think is important when we look at our role is bridge builders. And it's something that we always tell our students is to meet our clients where they are. But I just think it's just if you fill in with community, with students, with stakeholders, and be prepared to pivot. And we had to do a lot of that. And I think now as we're in this third year of the pandemic, kind of having that foundation has been able to serve as well as we start to move forward with our plans in our organizations and classrooms and institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan. Amy?
Hello, good afternoon. First, I want to echo the thanks to ISP under the leadership of Pilar Horner and ACOSA under the leadership of Cheryl Hyde for organizing us and the good work, Jason, you and Dr. Amy AMN did to put this panel together. So I'm happy to be here. For me, when I think about bridge building, of course. Okay, so let me back up and say, I have a 1.5-year-old. The pandemic is still going on in my household, and he's been a little angel this whole panel so far. Of course, when I am unmuted, he wants to make himself known. But anyway, that's what you might be hearing in the background. Okay, what I was going to say is when asked to be on this panel, it gave me a little smile thinking about myself as a bridge builder, because these days I feel like actually I've been more of a burner than a bridge builder. And I'll tell you why. When I reflect on it more, I think I'm both. But let me tell you a little bit about my framework, and then I'm going to take you through a short reflection for yourself. So for me, when I first started organizing, I was trained in both community organizing as well as political organizing. And the assumption that I was taught is you have limited time, you have limited volunteers and limited resources. So you have to be strategic about how you use them, right? And depending upon what campaign it is you're working on, whether for an elected official or for an issue, there are going to be people who are in your base that clearly support you and they're fired up. There are going to be people who are your opposition, who are fired up against you. And then there are people that are often called swing voters, or maybe they don't have an opinion yet, or maybe they're just not paying attention. So what I was taught was, as an organizer, your job is to focus on the swing, convincing people who can still be convinced until it's almost time to vote or make a decision, at which point your job is to rally your base. You don't really spend much time or interest trying to engage your opposition. Why? Because they're probably not going to budge. And that's sort of how I was taught to do things and how I went about my work as a social worker, as a community worker. There's work by Kristen Brock-Petrosius out of UCLA, who has been doing more research about what it means to appeal to one's opposition, which is exciting. I would refer folks to. But for me, I saw my role as a change agent as trying to support the base. For me, that meant groups already doing environmental justice organizing and racial justice organizing, or swing, which for me, I think of as social work students who haven't engaged in politics, who maybe have values that they can tell something's wrong or unjust in this world, but haven't really engaged in social change work. And so I kind of position myself as someone who's trying to assist groups already doing the work and or politicize, motivate, support, encourage students that I see as my swing. So in a way that's bridge building, or maybe it's like solidifying bridges. And then kind of what Karen was pointing to, and I think Bernice King was pointing to, is I do think there's a time and a place for social workers to be burners, that, you know, we're asked to participate in systems that are unjust. And sometimes we can kind of like make tweaks within them. And sometimes it's best to burn them down. And I think that's where abolition movement comes from, not just building down, but figuring out how to replace. I think that's part of what mutual aid aims to do as well. So with those thoughts in mind, that's sort of how I think of my role as a social change agent. I'd like to take our audience through a brief reflection. So Jason, I think, has a couple slides. And for those of you watching, I would literally ask you to get out a pen and a piece of paper or a pencil and we're going to do some good old fashioned reflecting. So I want to ask you how you see yourself as a change agent, as a social worker. Do you see yourself as a bridge builder or a burner? And maybe that's not an or, maybe it's a both and. Do you see yourself working inside or outside organizations? So Jason, if you could advance. So these are not bins. This is not a binary. But I'd ask you, and actually, let me put in the chat, I need to give acknowledgement and credit to a Chicago-based organization, Equiticity, who I'm adapting these questions from. So they deserve credit. Okay, under what conditions, in what scenarios do you see yourself as someone who's working on building towards social change? And by that, I mean coming together, bringing people together, perhaps creating new programs, institutions. Where do you see yourself as a burner, meaning you're needing to interrupt unjust systems? Another axis to think about is to what degree you do your social change work from within organizations, within programs, or where you see yourself pushing from the outside. Jason, if you don't mind. Next slide. So here's some questions to think about, both for you as an individual, as well as social work as a profession. Not only sort of where you land, and it could be the case that by day, by your career, you land somewhere, and by night, you land a different place, which then raises questions of, well, why is that the case? Is it easier to find a job as one versus the other, perhaps? As a profession, where do we land? Where should we land? I'm aware that we're short on time, so I'm going to jump down to this last set of questions. So do you find that the answer changes for you? And if so, why? What conditions influence where you land? It could be they've changed during the course of your life or during the course of your week. Does it have to do with your perceptions of power or powerlessness. So in other words, when you feel powerful and when you have meaningful resources, are you more of a builder or burner? Does it have to do with employment or recognition? What about, does it have to do with this change, the scale that's needed? So for example, if you're working on your block versus a city level or larger, do you find that you need to change? How much of your position has to do with your own degree of comfort with conflict or collaboration? And how much of that is based on gendered socialization or racialized socialization? So might there be some tactics and approaches that are more accessible for some people versus others? Or maybe there are other factors that I haven't mentioned. And so what does this tell you both about you today as a social change agent and also where you want to be? So I'm going to close with those questions and I think pass it back to Jason for sort of a combination of discussion, either on these questions or maybe other questions came up for folks.
I'm just going to take a second and put the questions in the chat so people have them. Give me 1 second. So we would love to see people's questions and thoughts and ideas. We really see this as you guys engaging with what you've heard from the panelists at this point. So please send us some questions. I did post them. Oh, I see. I fixed it. I was only on us in the chat. Any questions? Any thoughts? Gary, what should social workers do when confronted with countering values? Who wants to take a stab at this one? Any of our panelists want to take a stab at this one?
I can talk about that, Jason. I think that was very apparent in my role in facilitating the task force. I initially did not approach the task force as a facilitator consultant. I lived in the town. I've never done. I find Dr. Krings' questions fascinating because the proximity played a role there in how I facilitated. As a facilitator, as we all know, our role is supposed to be objective. We bring others forward to share their lens and perspective. So that was a challenge for me to navigate that position where I had to subordinate my own personal values, professional values in favor of what the group consensus was. And frankly, I'm still processing the learning that I gleaned from that, and also still processing whether for me personally, it is ethical to work in my own community in that role, or if it's a little bit too close to my values and the work that I do. So I don't know a clear answer to that question yet, Gary, other than to be reminded of the role that we're in at the moment. How does that influence our ethics and thinking through can we serve in those roles or not? What is appropriate for us?
Karen, Jan, or Amy, have anything to add?
I mean, I would just add, I think this relates to the second question in the chat as well. but I think I'm more mindful now about my own tolerance and my own mindfulness practices or caretaking practices, self-care, so that I can navigate those conversations from a authentic place where I can be more effective, particularly as a white person in spaces that I tend to be a more privileged person in, so that I could take on the leadership of some of that role. So I think actually bridging micro and macro in some way is also helpful here, and drawing upon those skills and teaching those skills to my students so that they can be more effective in confronting the bias and the racism, et cetera, that we have in real world conversations.
And I think that an important piece of it is just to honestly acknowledge them. Because I didn't realize that I had more biases that I acted like I did it until I was forced to confront them. And I think it's just being honest. I know it's cliched, it is of self-awareness and all the other type of stuff, but what does that actually mean? And to have those honest conversations, and if appropriate, state why there may be conflicting values, because others may not even get it. But one of the things that I have found of being clearly, and after my own reflection and awareness of what I'm uncomfortable with, of how to present it in a way that it's clear to who my partners are as well, because I'm sure as all of us in macro work, we're not surprised, but still surprised of how many things that seem so obvious are not. And I think just confronting them honestly, respectfully, and clearly is a very valuable step.
We had a question come in from Rhonda, which was, what are some strategies for combating misinformation? For instance, the blatant lies about critical race theory.
I actually am curious. I feel like this question needs to be raised more often at a national level, not only making sure social workers understand what institutional racism is and what critical race theory is, but also if and how to talk about it. I know there's different answers here. I'm not sure this is like the right one per se, but I tend to think pragmatically. I tend to teach critical race theory, but not necessarily call it critical race theory. So what I mean by that is, in my social welfare policy classes, we examine the history of the US, the creation of social welfare institutions and policies, as well as social welfare problems, using a race analysis. Why? Because so much of social welfare, including need and response or lack of response, is informed and shaped by race. And so it would be foolish not to center a racial analysis, and one that focuses on power dynamics and structure. I think those ideas are consistent with critical race theory. I don't necessarily, we do touch on critical race theory, but I don't necessarily say, okay, guys, here it is. You know, to me, it's like teaching history. So that's my answer. And like I said, humbly, I'd be curious how other folks handle those sorts of questions.
Well, in Georgia, we've been in the news, like other states, where it's been under a constant attack, and our legislator is even looking at all the systems in our state education system, really looking at zero in. So right now, we're in the process of how to navigate that. Because imagine for a school social worker, well, that's what we do. We're gonna do wipe out the entire school social work department. So what we have done also is focusing on the power analysis and just not calling it that, and looking at the inequalities. Because I think as you begin to look at the data and the research that's been vetted and not misinformation, certain patterns start to emerge on who's most negatively impacted by inequality. So that's one of the things that I don't have an answer per se, but that's where we are right now and how we're dealing with that, in addition to developing coalitions and broader advocacy, so that we can kind of nip this in the bud before we have, members of the legislature who decided to use this issue for maybe other purposes besides educational. So it's kind of that dual. What can you do within your institutional organization in your classroom and on the broader level of advocacy. So I think for us, it's been that 3-tiered approach, and also kind of figure out how to get on a similar page, because I don't think we'll always have the same page, but how to get on that working definition by what is meant for that. So again, we have that clear and consistent messaging.
Thank you for that. Tanya wrote a question, and she was wondering how we give students the ability to have conversations with people outside of our base. Do you worry that we're missing their perspectives? So everybody nodded their head. Who wants to start? Karen?
Sorry, couldn't unmute.
It looked like that's what you're trying to do.
I don't know. I think I'm reminded that I'm very fortunate, or I know, privileged to work in a community that doesn't have these kind of tensions. I work with, most of my undergrad students are students of color, and so they welcome an anti-racist frame, and it's still new to them, to a lot of them, but I don't have the same kind of resistance, not in terms of my legislature or my students or my university. So I appreciate that. Our university president is actually a social worker, so creates a little bit of a different opportunity for us. With that said, though, I do try to be inclusive. I make sure that, that readings are still inclusive and widespread. We have a lot of veterans, which we have a lot of non-traditional students, so students that are older. So really trying to represent diverse voices in terms of the learning materials that I expose students to is something that's really important to me. And also, I would say formal modality. So not just having readings or journals, although that's obviously something that's key, but mixing it up with documentaries and podcasts and things like that.
Somebody else want to, oh, Amy, I was going to ask you.
Yeah, just really quickly jump in here. I was looking up to make sure I attributed the quote correctly, but Margaret Wheatley said that all democracy begins with the conversation. So I appreciate the question that was posed. I do think, that is where we're well situated as social workers, right? And I think that Karen mentioned it before, it is another bridge, that micro-macro bridge, right? We are great at our interpersonal skills, and where there is room and space for people to have a dialogue, that's where I think we should be building those bridges, using our good interpersonal skills to engage folks in conversation. I have not brought this to fruition, but it has been my dream for a few years now to have an elective, maybe a required course on deliberative dialogue. So teaching those skills of how to engage in difficult conversations, I think that's the core of civic and civil life. And I think as a profession, we are uniquely situated to do that.
I just got to jump in for a second. One of the things that I teach in my classes is, regardless if you're micro focus or macro focus, really all of our engagement starts with a conversation. In community work, it's that one-on-one conversation, it's building rapport, it's building trust, and it's the same thing that happens when you have a client come into your office. So if we start seeing it as the relationship that we're trying to create as the foundation for all of our work, I think we get also out of this dyad of micro macro and start, as Karen mentioned earlier, really using our skills that we are teaching to our students to work regardless of the job you have when you leave a social work program. Kat had a question. When Amy was talking about building and burning bridges, they wanted to know, could you guys talk about how to know when each is most important from your own perspective? That's a good question. Who wants to start off?
I can, well, Karen, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think actually the reason to do such a reflection is to think about your own positionality and also the context in which you're working. I mean, so for instance, you've heard us talk about how the context is different in Atlanta versus Chicago versus Connecticut. And so there may be different opportunities based upon your geography. There could be different opportunities based upon your financial independence. There could be different opportunities based upon how deeply people are impacted by an issue, and how deeply you're passionate about an issue. I think that there's trade-offs to both approaches, and I think it's better. I don't think it's that helpful to say one is better than the other, because I think it's far more savvy, and you're more likely to have an impact as a change agent if you can do a power analysis, if you can understand what opportunities exist, what resources you have, knowing what's to ram their head against the wall repeatedly. So it's helpful too to think about what the long-term goal is, what your like guiding star is, as well as sort of like what smaller steps you can take. So I would say, like, I think part of what we can do as social workers is not just call people to be change agents, but bring some of this knowledge and these skills and tactics so that we can be effective change agents.
Karen, did you want to say something?
No, I mean, I was just smiling a little bit because I'm definitely a natural burner as well, Amy. So the bridge building is a little bit more challenging, but as I'm thinking more about it in the prompts that you provided for us, I think it's more about being strategic in each moment. So internal to the organization that I work in, since relationships are really important, I really am a good bridge builder, and I use that bridge building as leveraging privilege when I get myself into potentially risky situations. So that is how I'm able to do radical work. I'm able to confront power structures because I have the support, and I also invested in the organization. So on faculty or in the nonprofit setting, both, or I also worked as an organizer, labor organizer. So in all those settings, it's really about demonstrating that I invested. And once I'm able to do that and have those relationships with the clients, with the workers, with the students, then I'm able to be more effective in some of the burning activities as well. Because I think I'm more trusted coming from a place that I've demonstrated accountability.
I think for me, it ebbs and flows. It's kind of like, I don't want to say seasonal, but it is a bit seasonal. There are times in my career where I was much more of a burner. Lately, I think it's where I am personally. So I think that's the other piece of it too, in terms of assessing your readiness and where your energy is. So now I'm inching back towards burner. It goes back and forth, because particularly I'm now realizing with my role in our unit and in the university, my voice has power in certain places, and then there are other places where I need to use that power more in the background, if that makes any sense, where it's not so front and center. So I think for me, it's kind of that ebb and flow, and it's kind of not a perfect mix of where I am and my energy and interest at that moment versus what resources, power I can leverage, and it's kind of messy. So that's a non-answer, sorry, but it's kind of like it's not neat for me, and I feel like there's just like not a good divide.
I could just quick, Jason. I think there is a lot of nuance in that decision, and I think that's what all of your responses were leading to. And I'm not sure if I'm adding anything else here, but I do want to say there's a harm risk assessment that I tend to do, like who could be dramatically harmed if I decide to go the burning path. And I may have privilege to do that, but who could I hurt? Maybe, and not even seeing that. And with that, I think it's really important to do this work, right, in partnership or in teams. I was sharing with my co-creators a couple of weeks ago as we were planning for this. A friend was harmed in a recent effort. And, we're humans too. So just sitting and reflecting on how that can hurt. But long-term, what are we trying to achieve? And even though if we may want to burn the bridge at the moment, long-term, what does that mean? Is that the path we need to take? Or could we do more harm and risk by taking that action? So there is a lot of nuance and I think a lot of consultation in that process.
Thank you. We're running short on time. I'm gonna do one last question, and I'm going to turn to Liliana's question. Her entire practice class is watching us today. So one of the questions that came from this practice class was, let me see. How can macro social work students just about to graduate into the profession address the topics you've addressed as opposed to social workers with much more professional experience?
I'm just gonna reaffirm something I just said about working in coalition, partnership with others. I think that's very important, not only for learning, but also, again, this harm risk assessment that we're approaching with this work. And in the beginning, where I shared some of the statistics about where we are in society with growing incivility and hate, there's risk here. And so working alongside of someone that has a little bit more experience, or working in a group where it's not just one person who is raising their voice, but many, I think is a really good strategy for an emerging practitioner.
I'll jump in. I'll just say that if there's anything that I learned in the pandemic, it's humility, and that we all really don't know what's going on or what to do. And I think students really bring in new professionals, bring a new energy and a reality of lived experience in this liminal space that provides an opportunity that shouldn't be taken for granted and shouldn't be undermined because of lack of confidence. So I really would just implore you to, get out there and figure out what works for you and being a change agent. And I wouldn't let the lack of quote unquote professional experience deter you, because my students are the ones that hold me accountable, and I appreciate that so much. So.
Yeah, just think about what you have done and how it can be applied. That skills building, that scaffolding. Because I see that a lot with students when they say, "Oh, I don't know," and I'm like, "You know a lot more than you think." So even if you don't always have the confidence, but learn to be okay raising your hand and asking that question that you think no one else has, when 9 times out of 10 somebody else does. So don't let that go. Don't lose your passion and energy. And for those of you who are new to the field, we need you all so much, because as Karen said, you keep us on our toes and you bring up stuff that we may not see as clearly, because we come at it with our lens of all that experience. So they can come to us with something that doesn't make any sense. Why have you been doing it this long? So stand firm in your voice. Even if you don't feel confident, ask anyway.
I think it's really important for people who don't look like me to take up space. It's really important to take up space. Take the space that you need to ask your questions, to add input, to be heard, because if you don't, who's going to do it for you? Dr. Amen, Amy, any last thoughts?
Just to, oh, sorry, other Amy.
We got time for
other Amy.
I'll take your last thoughts too, Dr. Krings. Please go ahead.
I just want to support and encourage folks who participated in the panel today, especially folks that are new to this sort of work. And I think that it's important to be clear about kind of your North Star, your guiding purpose, where you're going, and then be accountable to folks and in relationship to folks for some of the reasons we talked about, so as not to do harm. And then from there, unfortunately, I think there's plenty of building and plenty of burning that needs to be done. And I think at that point, get in relationship with folks that are doing this work and can mentor you. So I would just say, good luck. We need you.
Dr.
And welcome.
Thank you. Dr. Amen, did you want to say anything?
I don't think I need to add much to that, other than the appreciation to the panel and our host today, ISP and ACOSA, the Brown School. Again, I can never say it enough in my career. Can't do this work alone. And I'm so very grateful for the collaborators today and for those who joined us. Thank you very much.
Well, so Dr. Amen took a little bit of my thunder, but I was going to thank the Brown School and Open Classroom for allowing us to use their technology, and ISP and ACOSA for their sponsorship of this event. I also want to give a special thanks to our panelists for giving us their time, their participation today. And finally, thank you to all of you who came. At one point I saw there was over 90 participants. Thank you to the students that came in your classroom and for engaging with us in this really important conversation. I hope you all have a great week, and this is recorded and you all have access to it. So thank you.